We are back on MorningLine. Thanks for joining us. We're on the Plus and streaming live on Facebook. If you have a question or comment for our guests, two of them that have been involved with the legalization of marijuana in other states, Kristi Kelly and Jax Finkel, are with us out of Michigan and Texas, Colorado before that. We've got Drew that waited on the phone through the break. Let's take his phone call. Drew, good morning. Hi, Drew.
How you doing today, Nick?
Good. What's on your mind?
I called my state representative and talked to his aide about marijuana, and quite frankly, and she tells me, she says, "Well, this is the Bible Belt." Well, I've got a good question for her. Well, what kind of God is there? My grandmother was a Sunday school teacher for 50+ years. Well, what kind of God is going to want to sit by and watch his people suffer while there's help just a prescription away?
Fair question on that. I mean, and you both have to recognize, yeah, sure, we're here in the Bible Belt in the South, but as you know, you said, Kristi, the poll here in Middle Tennessee, 80%. What I don't get here, and I live here, is that we have constituents. These are the people, the 80% you're talking about, vote for these state lawmakers, okay? And yet, the state lawmakers, either they're not listening to them or they're not being held accountable when it comes to this issue to move forward with at least medical marijuana. That's what I don't get. Their own constituents are telling them that they support this, and yet none of them, frankly, have the courage, well, a handful that have proposed it, to pass something like this. And I just have this image that in their head, they fear that come a campaign down the road, a challenger to their seat is going to say something like, well, you know what, that candidate there was legalizing drugs for your kids or some crap like that, and the voters just go, oh, okay, I'm going to vote for this other one. It's got to be that dumb. I just don't get it. If the support's there, why don't lawmakers follow suit, and why did they finally in these other states?
I mean, there's a religious aspect to talking about this, absolutely. So, you know, from the caller's point of view, talking about it from that religious aspect, in Genesis, God gave us every seed of all the plants for us to use for ourselves. Our body is created with this endocannabinoid system. We have cannabinoids that are created inside of our body, and that's the endocannabinoid system. And sometimes it needs some help. And so the plant can help bring that balance, bring that homeostasis. And so I think another thing that's important to talk about is compassion. Compassion is a tenet for many religions. So whenever we kind of loop all this together, there's a very conservative Christian former legislator here in Texas that said, God did not make any mistakes that the legislature needs to fix. And I think that if we're coming from that point of view, it's extremely important. You know, some people wonder, why does cannabis, you know, affect so many different conditions? And it's because this endocannabinoid system in your body is in so many different systems, and its goal is to bring homeostasis. So it's very important to understand that, because otherwise people think that you're just kind of like, oh, it's just this panacea of everything wonderful, and they don't really understand why does it affect all these different conditions. So I think that just talking about our body being created with it, God giving us these plants for us to use, and not making a mistake in what he decided to put on the earth for us.
Did it take just some courage? Yeah, go ahead. Kristi, from the lawmakers to get it passed. What was it pushed them over the top?
It was human stories. It was stories of people who were dependent on cannabis, who were essentially cannabis refugees from other places, or coming and relocating to Colorado for medical need because they could not get relief where they were. And that's because Colorado had passed a medical law long before the regulatory system came into existence. And so there were a number of people that were seeking relief who didn't make it all the way west to California, and stopped in Colorado to provide some sort of relief for their loved ones. But let's also go back to the geography. So we've got Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Virginia that have medical laws that are currently in their states right now. South Dakota and Nebraska both passed measures at the ballot. South Dakota passed a medical and adult use measure at the ballot, one constitutional, one initiated. Nebraska has many times over also passed, or Nebraska has also passed something at the ballot. And so, whereas perhaps before, maybe a decade ago, we might have been concerned about what the temperature of the country looks like. What we have is a very clear pathway where states are saying, yes, please. We do not think, for whatever reason, whether it's because of, medical or independent use, people are just saying, yes, please give us access to this plant. The way that things have been going don't make sense. We'd like the freedom to make that choice for ourselves.
And all right, and we've talked to this point about the humanitarian process and people making the choice and all this. If you just want to talk about cold, hard cash, I want to ask you, many of these states are going to look at it. Some folks who have absolutely no interest whatsoever in ever using marijuana of any type may be for it. Can you talk a little bit, Kristi, about what we saw and what the real numbers are with regard to the economic impact of marijuana, maybe medically, but especially, and I know it's a ways off from here in Tennessee, but the recreational marijuana market in Colorado and Michigan. How much money, okay, just tangibly speaking, the cold hard facts on the cash, how much money has it meant to those states?
Well, about a year and a half ago, Colorado logged in $1 billion in tax revenue. Most states that have a fully opted in medical and adult use program are looking at the hundreds of millions, generally speaking, and that's because of states that have established aggressive tax rates. Tennessee's sales tax, I believe, is 7%. In Tennessee, the adult population that has admitted to consuming cannabis in the last month or year is somewhere in the 13% range. So, I think we can do the math however we'd like, but looking forward into a full legalization program, I think that could represent a nice boon to Tennessee's economic baseline. In a more conservative medical marijuana system, I think that might look a little bit different. It really depends on whether or not there is a tax component to it. Tennessee does not currently tax for pharmaceutical products, and I would imagine because of the strong vocal presence from people who really understand and recognize the way that cannabis can help on the medical for debilitating medical conditions, that may be something that translates out. It may not, but there's also the ancillary impacts. And so what we're talking about here is cold hard taxes, but there's also other impacts. We're talking about job creation. We're talking about real estate stimulus, redeveloping communities and empty buildings that might have sat vacant for some time. We're talking about the ancillary businesses that support the legal cannabis industry. So technology companies, agricultural supply companies, marketing services, legal services, accounting, marketing, packaging companies, and the like. And so with the legalization of a new industry comes a number of ancillary services that are equally important to economic stimulus.
Sure, and just real quick, and I have a question for Jax to follow up, but real quick, Kristi, does it also, by decriminalizing it, kind of leave some of these folks that were the dealers on the street and dealing in drugs out in the cold?
That's exactly what we've seen in states like Colorado. So the more a legal economy is entrenched, at least in the data that we saw in both Colorado and in other states that legalized early, what we saw is that legalization came at the expense of the illegal markets. And so, yes, the two do have some sort of a correlation.
Okay. Good. I was just curious about that. And Jax, as far as, recreational, we can see why there'd be much more money coming in on that, on the tax coffers. But what about, have you seen with regard to just specifically with medical marijuana, like in Texas, is there an economic impact there?
Well, in Texas, we started a very limited program, and we only have a few licensees here. So the way that the program is sustained is through their licensing fees, and there has been quite a big growth in their employees. And so I think as we continue to add conditions and the patient pool continues to grow, we'll continue to see that grow. But in Texas, we are the same as Tennessee. We do not tax medicine. So this is not a way for us to raise money. This is a way for us to care for patients. And I think that's extremely important. But to Kristi's point, when we talk about a regulated adult use cannabis market, what your tax rate is usually has a direct result in how much of a quote unquote gray market you might have, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we see a more lower competitive tax rate, we see a lot more people moving into that arena because it's affordable instead of staying in the illicit market, right? And so I think it's extremely important that, you're going to make money through licensing fees, through taxation. All the ancillary things that Kristi brought up will be a big jobs boon as well. But, to your point earlier, legalizing medical cannabis is completely different than legalizing for an adult use market. And I think that we cannot let the conversations get in the way of each other. You can vote yes for patients and vote no for a regulated market down the road. So we hear that a lot from our legislators. Oh, medical cannabis is just a slippery slope. And I don't truly understand it, because they get to choose how they vote. And they can choose to vote no at that point. So the way I like to put it is, I'm on this train to try to change and reform laws and make them more common sense and better for our people. And however many stops you ride the train with me, I'm very thankful for that. But we have a lot of work to do. So I hope that in Tennessee, they'll follow Texas in making sure that we can have patients having safe access to this plant.
Before we go to the break, let's squeeze in a quick phone call from Ann. Ann, good morning. Hi, Ann.
Good morning. Here in Tennessee, besides being the Bible Belt, many of the lawmakers that keep turning down medical marijuana also own or have stock in our pharmaceutical companies. Therefore, they do not want to see this passed. What can I, a human story that has recently discovered Illinois and who has recently been able to not rely on sleeping pills, muscle relaxers, and pain medicine, do to get this passed in our state, where 80% want to see this overturned and passed?
All right, and we're going to take a break. I want you guys to mull that over, and we'll answer her question when we come back. She mentioned Illinois, by the way, if you're curious. That is the nearest legal marijuana repository where you can go and purchase from Nashville, Tennessee. Anna, Illinois. And you go across the border, and I've got people who have been up there, and they see license plates from all around the region in that parking lot. But that's the nearest one, and that's one that Ann is referring to, and she has to drive, if she chooses to, 2.5 hours to get there. And so, for her, the convenience for what's really helped her would be a big deal if medical marijuana was passed here in Tennessee. Let's take a break, and we'll be back and give you a chance to answer her question right after this.